Hi, it's Ron at Dirt Bike. Welcome to the 19's Dual Sport Edition. This is where we're going to take you up close and personal with all the 2019 Dual Sport bikes that we consider worthy of a magazine titled Dirt Bike. That's what we are. That's the way we evaluate them. We've paid a little attention to the new Honda CRF450L. We've seen the KTM 500 EXC. We've ridden the Beta 430 RRS. And we've ridden the Husqvarna FE450. Now it's time to get them all together, look at them back to back, and see which one comes out on top. First of all, the Honda is the big news in this category. We know that, everybody knows that. As you've already seen, it's taken over pretty much all the chat rooms. It's been a non-stop topic of conversation with dual sport enthusiasts for months now. We've had this bike for a long time. We love it. To review a little bit, it's loosely based on the CRF450R motocross bike. Has a lot of different part numbers simply because it is a dual sport bike. They had to wedge another gear into that transmission. It's a 6-speed. The frame had to be wider. There are brackets. There are charcoal canisters. It's fully compliant with all the EPA and dual sport regulations for the US. After having ridden it for a while, we'll tell you the bullet points up front. Its suspension, incredible. Its weight, also a little incredible. It's heavy. As far as components go, Honda kind of split the difference. It has very top line LED headlight system, by far the best lighting system of all the dual sport bikes in this shootout. On the other hand, it's the only bike that has a manual cable clutch. It's the only bike that has 7/8 inch handlebars. Doesn't have handguards. So Honda clearly chose its battles, choosing where to spend money and where to economize. The stock tires are IRCs that are mostly street oriented. They're not bad on the dirt, but we wanted to go a little bit further as far as our dirt capabilities, so we put Mitas full knobs on this bike like the other bikes. The Mitas tires look just like full dirt bike tires, but they are DOT approved. They're perfectly legal in the US and all 50 states. The Honda actually comes in at the least expensive bike in the shootout. We don't say the cheapest because none of them is cheap. It sells for $10,399. That's with all the stuff that your dealer is going to add in. We know that's a healthy investment. Honda chose to take this bike seriously, and they also priced it very close to its competitors in the European market. Some of you haven't even heard of Beta. Beta is a small Italian manufacturer. They don't manufacture a lot of bikes every year, but one of the things they do make is dual sport bikes, and they make a lot of them. Beta has 4 different models. For this shootout, we used the Beta 430 RRS. This is a little bit smaller in displacement than the other bikes, but it's a worthy competitor for a 450 in a lot of ways. Beta doesn't make an off-road 4-stroke. They don't make a motocross 450. They don't make anything in the 4-stroke category except for dual sport bikes. This bike is set up like a dirt bike. It has sack suspension, front and rear, full linkage in the rear, and it is pretty much stripped down as it comes. There isn't too much hype, there's not too much extra. The one thing they did add to the bike that we're completely pleased with is a TrailTech GPS. It replaces the odometer speedometer combination you would see on a normal bike. It also comes with handguards, and it comes with a lithium-ion battery. There's no Kickstarter there. If you run the battery dead, you will have to push, so don't do that. The clutch is hydraulic. The brakes are Nissan discs, just like any dirt bike you might see from Japan. In terms of tires, Beta chose to equip the bike with Michelin Enduros tires, which are full DOT legal, but they're European spec knobby, which means they have a shorter knob height. As we did with the other bikes, we equipped the Beta with Mitas dual sport tires. Again, street legal, but very aggressive. In terms of price, the Beta comes in just above the Honda at $10,499. Husqvarna was the first company to take dual sport really seriously. They made the first dual sport bike that we would consider a legitimate off-road bike. And in fact, at that time, they stopped making their off-road 450. They were the first of this whole breed of motorcycle. Now, of course, KTM manufactures Husqvarna, the same factory, but this bike is very, very different from KTM in a lot of ways. For one thing, it uses linkage rear suspension. All the bodywork is different. It has different components. It uses Magura brakes and a Magura master cylinder for its clutch. The airbox is unified with the subframe. The whole bike has a very, very different feel from a KTM. Of all the Husqvarnas that have KTM counterparts, this one has the most Husqvarna in it. There is no 450 version of this bike in the KTM line. Up front, the Husqvarna uses a WP Explorer 48 fork. This is the coil spring version of the air fork that comes on the motocross bike. Husqvarnas usually are more expensive than KTM's, but since there is no KTM 450 to compare this with, they set the price at $11,099. Husqvarna's pricing is usually a little bit higher than KTM's pricing, but there is no KTM 450 to compare this with. Husky set the price at $11,099. The KTM 500 EXC is in this comparison simply because KTM does not make a 450. There is a limited edition 6 days version that comes out at the end of every year. We didn't have access to one of those, and frankly, most of us don't either. It's only made in very, very small numbers. So putting the 500 against the 450s and the 430, is that fair? Well, we decided to do it because we really wanted to include KTM in this shootout, and after all, we more or less know what the 450 version of this bike would be like because, well, we have a Husqvarna and it has the same motor that the 6 days edition of the KTM EXC would have. The biggest difference between the KTM and the Husqvarna, of course, is the rear suspension. KTM has PDS rear suspension, and again, off-road guys love this. They've loved it since 1999. The fork, the exact same fork that is on the Husky. It's the WP Explorer 48. It's a coil spring fork, unlike the air spring fork that's on the motocross versions. The motor, it's a 6-speed. KTM found enough room for another gear in the gearbox, and the ratios are spread out widely enough to make the bike work off-road and still be fairly comfortable on the road. In terms of brakes, if you're a KTM guy, you know the answer to this one. They're Brembos, and they're very strong, just the exact same units that they have on the motocross bikes. The price of the KTM, it's $11,199. That is the high water mark for dual sport bikes, aside from the Husqvarna 500, which we haven't included in this shootout, which is $100 more. So we've been riding this group of dual sport bikes for a few months now, and man, we've been having a good time. We've learned a lot of stuff. First things first, you can't get around the weight issue. We have a pretty big range of weight from these bikes. Of course, the Honda being the heaviest and the KTM being the lightest. It doesn't quite break down like you'd expect it. The Beta, you know, it's about 10 pounds heavier than the KTM. It actually feels lighter. There's probably a lot of reasons for that. We know that the characteristics of a motor contribute a lot to the feeling of weight. And that big motor in the 500 gives a little bit of a disadvantage in that department. The KTM has a little bit more engine braking and a little bit more of a lumbering feel to it. Having said that, they both do feel very, very light. They feel like legitimate dirt bikes. Next up above that, Husqvarna FE450, still a touch lighter than the Beta, feels quite a bit heavier. Again, has to do with the motor. That motor feels a little bit more choked up. On the other end of the scale is the Honda, which, as we knew going into this, it has a big weight disadvantage. There's no getting around that. When you add in the fact that that motor has a lot of engine braking, it just complicates the issue. It's a pretty big boy. Honda's done a really good job overall with the handling and the steering of the bike. It is one of the best cornering bikes that we have here, despite its weight. In terms of power, there's a pretty wide range here as well, not just in the amount of power, but in the way they feel. At the top of the list, the Beta, despite its smaller engine, is the most powerful. It has the most peak power and it revs out the farthest. The KTM, with its big motor, is a little more torquey down low, and it has a little bit more of a lurchy feel. Next comes the Honda. It's actually very, very close in power to the KTM 500. Honda did a marvelous job with this motor. It's a 450, but it has a huge hit of power right down low. When you first crack the throttle on the Honda, it goes. It doesn't wait around. The Husqvarna, well, it's a lot like the KTM. It's a smaller motor, like you would expect. So it doesn't quite have that big knot of low-end torque the way the KTM does. Overall, though, if you had to rank these bikes, just do a straight-out acceleration test, the Beta would come out on top. The Husky would probably be just a touch behind the other two. Since all these bikes have to meet EPA regulations, they're pretty choked up with noise and with emissions. Beta has a little bit of an advantage here because being a small company, they aren't scrutinized nearly as closely as Honda, KTM, or Husqvarna. As a result, the fuel mapping for the Beta feels like a dirt bike. It doesn't feel at all choked up. It's a little louder than the other bikes, and that probably gives a little advantage in the horsepower department as well as in the fuel mapping department. KTM and Husqvarna came a long ways in fuel mapping from last year's bikes. The whole motor, everything was brand new last year. Now they've fine-tuned their key and EFI systems a little bit. They no longer have the flame-out issue that they had somewhat last year. It wasn't big, it was noticeable though. This year it's almost gone. The Honda has a very interesting feel. It does feel lean and it does feel kind of corked up. And one of the ways that manifests itself is in a tendency to stall. This isn't the type of flame out issue that you often have with very lean motorcycles. It never stalls on acceleration, only when the throttle is completely shut. Of course, this isn't nearly as big a deal as a flame out issue when you just open the throttle and suddenly pop, the motor's gone. The Honda never does that, but you have to keep it running when you're at low RPM and when you're at slow speeds like tight trails, things like that. All these bikes have similar top speeds. When you get them on the road, they all have 6-speed transmissions, and when you click into 6th, you have a little room to breathe. They're not revving their guts out on the street. In terms of their ratios, the Beta has the tightest ratios. First gear is pretty tall on that bike, and then all the ratios are a little bit closer together. The Honda's at the other extreme. It has the lowest first gear, almost a granny first gear. In suspension, we have pretty wild engineering differences between these four motorcycles. The KTM and Husqvarna, of course, come out of the same factory, but they have completely different rear suspension setups. The KTM uses the PDS no linkage system. The Husqvarna has much the same type of linkage that their motocross models do. Now, there are two completely different camps on this subject. The PDS guys, they love it. They have much better ground clearance on the bottom. In fact, guys like Cody Webb, Graham Jarvis just love the PDS system for going over extreme terrain. That suspension system also contributes to the fact that the KTM is the lightest of the bunch. Having said that, as speeds pick up at higher speeds, people generally prefer linkage suspension like we have on the Husqvarna. The Beta also has linkage for the rear suspension system, and it uses Sachs components. Sachs components are kind of a little bit unknown when it comes to most suspension tuners in the US. We're getting more familiar with them. This particular bike feels a little soft initially, and then it seems to have more or less a wall of damping that you hit about halfway down. So it feels a little bit soft when it comes to braking and suspension dive. On the other hand, it doesn't quite get the plush feel that you get on some of the other bikes. When it comes to plush ride, there's nothing that compares with the Honda. It's clear that Honda knows what it's doing in this department. It uses basically the same suspension components as the motocross bikes, all top-of-the-line stuff. It's just that the spring and damping rates are set up for dual sport, and it is the most comfortable bike by far. That's the thing about dual sport bikes. You tend to spend long periods of time in the saddle doing what you're going to do, whether it's crossing a state or just connecting trails. That's why having a lot of details well thought out on the bike are a big advantage. The Beta, for instance, it has a pop-off seat. If you do drain the battery, you can easily jump-start it. It also has a GPS, standard equipment. This is something you would have to pay extra for on the Honda, the KTM, or Husqvarna. The Honda, on the other hand, has by far the best headlight of the bunch. It actually is powerful enough that you can ride at night. As we all know, both the KTM and the Husqvarna have excellent components. The handlebars, the rims, even though in some cases they go to different makers, both of these bikes have top of the line stuff. So when the smoke clears and it's all done, we've got to make our decision based on which we think is the best dirt bike. That's who we are. We're Dirt Bike Magazine. And when it comes down to that, we aren't as concerned about how these bikes work if you're commuting back and forth to college or if you plan on just doing 100% street riding. It's about dirt for us. And when you look at it strictly on that basis, the Beta is an easy choice among these four motorcycles. The Beta has the power. It feels like a real dirt bike. And there are virtually no compromises anywhere on this motorcycle. Next in line, well, in this group, we'd have to go with the KTM. It simply has a horsepower advantage over its brother-in-arms, the Husqvarna. We know comparing a 450 to a 500 isn't quite fair, but having said that, Husqvarna also does have a 500, and those bikes would be more or less on par with one another. Having said that, Husqvarna also does have an FE450L. It has the same motor in it as the KTM 500 EXC. If you compare those bikes side by side, it would more or less be a toss-up. At the other end, we have the Honda, which we love, but it's much more street-oriented than the other two bikes. It's hard to get around that weight disadvantage, and it is just a little bit more cumbersome to ride. If you wanted to use the bike for crossing continents, you know, it'd be hard to argue against something like the CRF450L. But for us, once again, we're on board with the Beta. For more depth on our dual sport shootout, check out the February 2019 issue of Dirt Bike Magazine. And if you've missed any of our individual features on these bikes, click on the playlist that's coming up now.